So a lot of people on Twitch have been asking me what loadouts I'm planning on bringing into the day one raid. And while I haven't decided exactly what I'm bringing in yet, I figured I'd make a quick YouTube video showcasing what I'll probably be bringing in bar any disables. This video will not be going over what subclasses my team is running, what mods we're running, or what changes we think Bungie will make. This is strictly a what weapons do I think you should consider bringing in to make the raid as smooth as possible. So I think one of the biggest issues I notice with most day one prep videos is that the creator suggests items that are not easy to use in a day one scenario, or are just not needed, and for teams that are actually needing advice from day one loadout suggestions, these add so much complexity that the team probably shouldn't even be attempting it in a day one scenario in the first place. While Bungie is lowering our outgoing damage in this day one by an unknown value, history has shown that easy items will still get you the clear on contest just as much as hard items, at least in every day one since Deepstone Crypt. A lot of people said War Priest was a huge DPS check in King's Fall, but in reality he wasn't. My team ran a Divinity, a Well of Radiance, and 5 linear fusions, and we held left click the entire time, and we comfortably 4-phased, nearly even 3-phased him on challenge. You typically don't need to complicate your day one damage rotations by doing an Izanagi into a Wilderflight, into 2 bait and switch rockets, into a Strand Super, then grapple reload. You just don't. You can hold left click and you'll usually get the clear as long as you have ammo to fulfill your entire heavy reserves. If you're able to do those rotations, great, but historically that stuff has never been needed, and you're going for a 3 or 4 phase here. You're not going for a 1 phase. There's no world record prize for being the first team to 1 phase on contest. Bungie gives you multiple phases on raid bosses for a reason. They're not expecting you to 1 phase the boss. Yeah, doing these rotations might make you 3 phase instead of 4 phase, or 2 phase instead of 3 phase, but usually these rotations is the difference between you 4 phasing the boss and you 4 phasing the boss. The point is, without these rotations, as long as you have ammo, you will still get the clear. The way I'm going to structure this video is kinetic weapons, then energy weapons, then heavy weapons. Timestamps are in the description if you're interested in only a specific part. Alright, kinetic weapons. I'm going to start off with exotics and then I'm going to move on to legendaries. The first weapon I'm going to suggest is Osteo Striga. This is a primary, so it has infinite ammo, it aims for you, it does really good damage, insane ad clear, and the poison spreads to nearby targets. Specifically, I think this is going to be a sleeper pick for the Abyss, and I haven't seen that many people mention this. Its ease of use is a 13 out of 10, and in stressful, high adrenaline situations like day one raids, weapons that have a ease of use above a 10 out of 10 are the weapons you're looking for. Since Crota is a hive raid, if there are any barrier knights, having a consistent barrier option is going to be good, so Wish Ender and Arbalist get my picks here. Barrier knights can't be crit, so these two instantly breaking their shields is fantastic. I don't like the idea of needing to rely on Radiant or Volatile for barrier, and the artifact choices are bow and auto rifle. If you're using a bow, it's probably Wish Ender, but if you do decide to use a kinetic AR, I would go with Rufus's Fury. I'll give a shout out to Izanagi's Burden as well because it's high damage and does a lot of burst damage, and this helps with high value targets or bosses. I'm also going to give a shout out to Malfeasance, but I think Malfeasance will be disabled for the day one. A lot of people love to bring in Lumina too, and it's a good idea since it's a 35% buff that overrides Well of Radiance, but again, in my experience, I've brought Lumina into every day one since VOW, and I've never actually used it. I've had it as an option, but it's one of those things I'm like, I don't actually need this, and it's just adding more complexity to an already complex activity. In terms of legendaries, Heritage for close range burst, so slug shotguns are great, Succession for that long range damage, and then I'm the #1 Smite of Moraine fan, so I'm going to suggest a pulse rifle for your long to medium range ad clear. I know a lot of people love to suggest blinding grenade launchers, which are never a bad choice, but historically I haven't found myself using one of these or needing to use one of these in a day one, so I'd rather use my special weapon on something that's actually going to kill enemies instead of something that's going to make them not die. I know a lot of people like them though, and so I figured I'd mention it before the comments say that I didn't suggest it. For exotic energy weapons, I suggest Trinity Ghoul, Risk Runner, and Dead Messenger. You will not use Merciless. You are not going to be using Cloud Strike. You are not going to be using Ariana's Vow. You are not going to be using Fourth Horseman, and you are not going to be using Telesto. Again, the 3 exotics I mentioned are easy, so easy to use. Trinity Ghoul does the work for you. It does insane ad clear. And going back to the idea of barrier champions, it's also anti-barrier if you have the bow artifact mod. Trinity Ghoul's ease of use is an 11 out of 10 once you get the perk procced, so that's good. You just fire it. You can hip fire it, you don't really need to aim because it will chain to nearby enemies. Risk Runner has an ease of use of a 9 out of 10, and since Hive deal a lot of arc damage, this is going to be a huge pick, especially for ad-dense locations like the Abyss. Dead Messenger is the 3rd exotic that I suggest. And why? Well, Bungie has already mentioned that they're adding more shields, and this can cycle through all 3 shield elements. Also, Dead Messenger is becoming craftable when Vox Obscura is the mission, which it will be tomorrow, Tuesday, August 29th. And it has new perks like Demolitionist and Unrelenting. Unrelenting giving you your health back, great, you can't die. Demolitionist giving you your nade back, great, you also can't die because everything's dead because you're getting a million grenades. Also, Dead Messenger is a waveframe which have insane ad clear potential, and so its ease of use is very high because you shoot the ground, you don't actually have to shoot at enemies. The downside to this though is that the terrain in Crota may be very rough, and therefore it might not be a waveframe friendly environment. For legendary energy weapons, Forbearance is of course number 1, and similar to Dead Messenger, it's a waveframe, but this one does not take up your exotic slot. I don't have any other special weapons here whose role isn't already covered in the kinetic section. I tend to avoid double special in day 1 raids, and especially now after the heavy drop nerf, I don't think that it's required. You could use a trace rifle, but for the main part, the rest of these energy weapons are going to be primary weapons. I like Callus Mini Tool and the iClose SMG for close range fights. I tend to alternate between these 2 SMGs and Unforgiven for anything that requires relatively close range. All of Ron, I used Unforgiven, and Daughters in King's Fall, I used the iClose SMG. I also really like the Last Perdition Pulse Rifle for medium range encounters, similar to Smite of Moraine. I used Last Perdition during Totems and War Priest for Day 1 King's Fall, and I loved it. Having Shoot to Loot isn't a bad choice either, as I mentioned before, whether that be a Scout or a Trace. But again, I've never found myself actually using Shoot to Loot in a Day 1 raid. The good thing though is a Scout does work as Unstop this season, so if there are any unstoppable ogres, it's not a bad choice. I'm not going to suggest Wilderflight because again, realistically in a day 1 scenario, Wilderflight is the difference between you 4-phasing a boss and you 4-phasing a boss. Some other shouts I will give though is Divinity if you do decide to use precision heavies, like Linears, Sunshot if you're using Ember of Empyrean to extend restoration, and a 1-2 punch shotgun if you're running Arc Strider. For exotic heavy weapons, if you do decide to use rockets for damage, which you probably should, you're going to want at least 1 Gallarhorn for Pack Hunter, and this is a must. One person using Tractor Cannon for the free 30% debuff is also a very good choice, and I'm also going to give a shout out to Xenophage here. Its ease of use is a 19 out of 10, it deals good damage to high priority targets, but is not the best for boss damage. Its ammo economy isn't that bad either, it holds, I think, 28, so that's not bad. It did go crazy during Totems and King's Fall, and while I don't see it being as good anymore since rockets are so good now, I do think that it's not a bad thing to have in your back pocket. The last exotic I'm going to mention is everyone's favorite, Thunderlord. Thunderlord's ease of use is a 35 out of 10. It's literally hold left click. Bungie did nerf the interaction with Divinity where it was dealing too much damage when paired with Divinity, and Bungie is making our outgoing damage deal less, but this is the easiest of the easiest damage strategies that have been used in recent raids. It allowed for a 2-phase on Nezarec and Ron, and while I'm not saying that the bosses in Crota's End will be as squishy as Ron, I just don't think that Thunderlord is a bad choice for teams that don't feel comfortable using rockets. And the chances that you're going to be using something like Leviathan's Breath, Legend of Acreus, Parasite, or Lament, I think is in the negatives. For legendary heavy weapons, an Eager Edge sword for movement is great, but if you're not going for worlds first, this is not needed. An Apex Predator with bait and switch is great as well, and a machine gun like Commemoration is fantastic for ad clear. I'm also going to give a shout out to Cataclysmic as a linear fusion rifle. Perks like bait and switch are usually not the greatest for day 1 raid scenarios because if you do run out of ammo in a special weapon, you lose out on 35% damage. That being said, bait and switch is way too good. It's way too good. Especially on something like Apex Predator, you can't pass this up. There's been a lot of conversation recently about bait and switch versus bipod for a day 1 raid, and I'm on team bait and switch, as are, I would say, about 95% of day 1 raiders. My team did some testing too, and bait and switch won against bipod 11 days a week. The only issue with bait and switch is that to get the actual best bang for your buck is you need to actually do a damage rotation with it. An Izanagi rotation, a slug rotation, a sniper, a fusion, something like that. The good thing though is that these rotations are relatively easy to pull off and you don't need to do anything super fancy. Bipod, on the other hand, doesn't require you to do a fancy rotation. It's idiot proof. You fire it, you reload. You fire it, you reload. You fire it, you reload. So if you don't want to add that complexity of a rotation, just use bipod. But be aware that realistically speaking, it's not the best choice. I'm not saying it's bad, because it's an easy perk to use and it does decent damage, but bait and switch is way too good that competitive teams are going to be using bait and switch. And while LFRs did get nerfed, they are a extremely consistent source of damage, which is why I did mention Cataclysmic. For a boss like Crota, who doesn't have a crit, LFRs will be useless, even if we do deal damage to him, but Ear-Ute, it could be a usable item. And that's basically it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you leave a like and drop a subscribe, as that really helps the channel out. Good luck on the raid on Friday, everyone. And if you aren't raiding day 1, you are more than welcome to stop by my stream, twitch.tv/all_the_players. I will be live streaming the world's first race. I'll be live about 3 hours before the raid goes live.